All right, welcome in everybody to the deep dive. We've got a really fascinating topic to dig into today, and that's Orthodox asceticism.
Hmm.
Now, I know that word, asceticism, it can sound kind of intimidating right off the bat.
Yeah, maybe even a little bit scary for some folks.
For sure, it brings to mind like, extreme self-denial, maybe even some pretty harsh practices,
Put
right?
like hair shirts and living in a cave somewhere.
Exactly, but what we're going to find as we delve deeper is that Orthodox asceticism is actually about something much more profound and ultimately more beneficial for your spiritual life.
It is. It's really about fostering a much deeper connection with God, and it's rooted in these ancient Christian practices that have been kind of honed and refined over centuries, you know?
Yeah, and what's really great is we've got this really fantastic blog post from Orthodox Christian Tools that we're going to be using as a springboard for our conversation today.
Yeah, it's a great resource. It really cuts to the core of the ideas, and it's very practical, very focused on how you can actually apply these principles in your own life, wherever you're at.
And that's really our mission today is to, unpack this idea of Orthodox asceticism, see what it's really about, and explore, how these age-old practices might actually be surprisingly relevant for you today.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. What is Orthodox asceticism? I mean, because that term itself can sound a little, I don't know, heavy.
Yeah, you're right. The blog post actually addresses that right away.
Hmm.
Um, and it makes it clear that it's not simply about like mere self-denial or just extreme austerity for its own sake.
So it's not just saying no to everything just 'cause.
No, not at all. It's really presented as this holistic approach to spiritual life, and it involves several key elements working together. Things like fasting, prayer, simplicity, and self-discipline.
So there's a deeper purpose behind these practices.
Oh, absolutely. It's all geared towards purifying the heart, quieting the mind, and ultimately drawing you closer to God. That's the whole point.
And the blog post talks about theosis as being like the ultimate goal. Now that's a pretty big concept.
It is. It is.
So how can we kind of wrap our heads around that?
Well, theosis, it's often translated as like becoming one with God or divinization. But the post makes it clear that it's not about, escaping the world or somehow like dissolving into this kind of abstract divine essence.
So it's not just checking out a reality.
No, it's about sanctifying the world through your actions and your intentions. It's about becoming more Christ-like, reflecting his love and his nature in your own life.
So it's more about bringing that divine connection into the everyday how you interact with the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a process of transformation. It's a journey.
Yeah, I like that. So it's less about withdrawing and more about an inner transformation that then affects how we live outwardly.
Okay, so the blog post breaks down Orthodox asceticism into these pillars. And the first one we're going to look at is fasting. And like most people, I think my mind immediately goes to food.
Right, of course.
But it sounds like there's a broader understanding of fasting within Orthodox asceticism.
There is. The blog post really emphasizes that it's not just about abstaining from food, but it's about cultivating self-control, mindfulness, and gratitude. Those are the real benefits they're looking for.
So what's the underlying reason for fasting? What's it actually meant to achieve?
Well, there are several key reasons that are highlighted in the blog post. First, it helps you to detach from worldly desires and focus more on spiritual growth. So it's about kind of shifting your focus, your priorities.
Okay, so it's about what you're turning away from and what you're turning towards. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And secondly, it fosters a sense of solidarity with those who suffer from hunger and poverty. It's a way of connecting with the less fortunate.
That makes sense. So there's this kind of social dimension to it as well.
Yeah. And perhaps most interestingly, fasting creates space for prayer and reflection.
Hmm.
It allows you to hear God's voice more clearly.
That's an interesting idea. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? How does fasting create space for prayer and reflection?
Well, think about it this way. When we're constantly consuming, whether it's food or information or entertainment, kind of fills up our mental bandwidth. It's like there's all this noise and distraction. Fasting, in a sense, clears that bandwidth. It creates this quiet space where you can be more receptive to God's presence, to those quieter, more intuitive thoughts.
It's like creating that inner stillness.
Exactly, yeah.
So the blog post mentions some typical fasting practices like avoiding meat and dairy.
Right? And depending on the specific fasting period and the tradition, sometimes even oil and alcohol are restricted.
So there's different levels of fasting.
Yeah, there is. There is.
Yeah.
But the crucial point is that The physical act of fasting, it's really just the starting point. The real transformation, the real work happens in the heart, as you learn to rely on God rather than on your own strength or on the immediate satisfaction of your physical cravings.
So it's about shifting that dependence from external things to something deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the next pillar we're going to look at is prayer. And the blog post calls this the cornerstone of Orthodox asceticism. So it's clearly central.
Oh, absolutely. And again, it's presented as much more than just a routine or just reciting words. It's about entering into a deep, intimate conversation with God. That personal connection is key.
And there's a specific prayer that the blog highlights, which is the Jesus prayer. And it even gives the words, which are, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Why is this specific prayer so significant in Orthodox asceticism?
It's considered to be one of the most powerful prayers in the Orthodox tradition, and part of its power lies in its simplicity. It's short, it's easy to remember, and the repetition, it helps you to stay humble and constantly aware of your dependence on God's grace. It's a way of kind of centering yourself throughout the day.
Yeah, keeping that awareness of your relationship with God kind of at the forefront of your mind.
Exactly.
And there's also mention of a daily rhythm of prayer in the blog post. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. The blog outlines 3 key moments for prayer. Morning prayer, which sets the tone for the day and invites God's guidance. Noon prayer, which serves to refocus the mind amid all the distractions that we all face. And evening prayer, which offers thanksgiving and a time for reflection on the day's lessons.
So it's about weaving prayer into the fabric of daily life.
Exactly, making it an ongoing dialogue rather than just something you do every once in a while.
And it sounds like this disciplined approach to prayer isn't just about talking to God, but it's also about shaping who we become. The blog post mentions the cultivation of virtues through prayer.
That's right. Through disciplined prayer, we cultivate virtues like patience, humility, and charity. And these virtues, as the blog points out, they enrich not only our spiritual lives, but also our relationships with others.
So there's this ripple effect outward.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, the third pillar we're going to look at is simplicity. And that can feel like a really tough one in our modern world.
Yeah, for sure.
So how does Orthodox asceticism approach simplicity?
Well, the blog post calls it a radical act of faith in our noisy, distraction-filled world. It's about intentionally letting go of material excess and focusing on what truly matters.
And one aspect of this is detachment from possessions, but the blog makes it clear that this isn't necessarily about becoming destitute, right?
Right. It's not about poverty, but it's about living intentionally with gratitude for what you have and creating space for spiritual wealth.
So it's more about a shift in focus from accumulating things to appreciating the deeper dimensions of life.
Exactly.
And the blog post also talks about limiting digital noise, which I think really resonates with a lot of people today.
Oh, absolutely. We're constantly bombarded with information and notifications, and it can be really difficult to find that quiet space for prayer and meditation.
Yeah, I feel that.
So setting boundaries around technology,
Yeah.
being more intentional about when and how you engage with it, that's crucial for creating those pockets of quiet where you can really connect with yourself and with God.
It's about reclaiming your attention.
Exactly.
And closely linked to this is the idea of silence and solitude.
Right.
So how important are those elements in Orthodox asceticism?
They're essential.
Mm.
The blog post describes them as being essential for cultivating inner peace and developing spiritual discernment. It's often in the stillness that we can really hear God's voice most clearly.
So it's about creating that space for listening. Okay, now the blog post also delves into the spiritual significance of self-denial. Now again, that phrase can carry some pretty negative baggage.
Yeah, I understand.
So what's the more nuanced understanding of self-denial within Orthodox asceticism?
Well, the key insight is that it's not about suffering for its own sake, but it's about peeling away the layers of attachment that keep us from fully experiencing God's presence. It's about removing the obstacles.
Things that are getting in the way.
Yeah, yeah.
And this involves detachment from worldly desires, which kind of echoes the idea of simplicity that we talked about earlier.
It does, yeah. By letting go of those materialistic distractions, those fleeting desires, you cultivate a deeper sense of contentment and trust in God's providence.
So it's about finding your security and your fulfillment in something deeper than those external things.
Exactly.
And the blog also mentions developing spiritual fortitude through self-denial. How does that work? How does self-denial contribute to spiritual fortitude?
Well, think of it like training a muscle. you
Mhm.
know? By choosing to forego certain comforts or desires, you're you're gradually building up your inner resilience. You're making yourself less reactive, more grounded, more able to face life's challenges with grace and humility.
So it's about strengthening that inner core.
Exactly.
And all of these practices, fasting, prayer, even acts of service like almsgiving, they're all connected to this larger goal of aligning our desires with God's will.
That's right. Yeah. They're all different ways of opening our hearts more fully to divine love and compassion. And that's the ultimate goal.
So it's about becoming more receptive to that love and compassion and then letting it flow through you.
Yeah.
So bringing this into the 21st century, why is Orthodox asceticism still relevant today? The blog describes it as a countercultural path to spiritual growth.
Well, in our, fast-paced consumer-driven world, these practices offer a really different perspective. They remind us that true fulfillment isn't found in endless acquisition or external validation, but in our inner life, in our connection to something larger than ourselves.
It's about going against the grain a little bit.
It is, yeah.
And one of the specific benefits that the blog highlights is cultivating gratitude. How does that emerge from these practices that, on the surface might seem restrictive?
Well, when you simplify your life, you become much more aware of the many blessings that you might otherwise take for granted. By refraining from certain things, you develop a deeper appreciation for what you already have.
So it's about shifting your perspective, appreciating the simple things.
Exactly, yeah.
And there's also this aspect of building community, which I wouldn't immediately connect with, these personal practices of self-denial.
Right. But the blog explains that practices like shared fasting periods, or acts of almsgiving, they foster a sense of solidarity. They encourage us to live in a more generous and compassionate way.
So it creates these shared experiences and a common purpose.
Yeah, it does.
And ultimately, all of this is geared towards deepening faith. So how do these practices contribute to that?
Well, through consistent prayer, through self-discipline, you grow in spiritual insight. You become more resilient. You become, as the blog puts it, a vessel of God's grace in the world.
So it's about refining yourself so that you can be a better conduit for that grace.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up our deep dive into Orthodox asceticism, what would you say is the most important message to take away?
Well, I think it's that Orthodox asceticism isn't just a set of rules. It's a transformative journey that leads to a deeper communion with God. It's about creating space for God in your life through these practices of fasting, prayer, and simplicity.
And aligning your desires with his will.
Yes, exactly.
And these aren't just, outdated practices from the past. The blog post really emphasizes that these ancient practices are still incredibly relevant and powerful today, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey.
Absolutely. They offer a timeless wisdom that speaks to, the fundamental challenges and longings of being human.
So, for you, the listener, as you reflect on this conversation, consider which of these practices might resonate with you. Maybe there's one small step you could take this week to explore it further. Perhaps, taking a few moments of silence each day, being more mindful of your consumption, or even just reflecting on a time when simplicity brought you a sense of clarity. It's about finding what works for you and taking that first step on a potentially deeper, more fulfilling journey.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for having me.